Modernizing economic metrics, why GDP falls short and how household GDP can bridge the gap. Gap. Executive summary. Gross domestic product, GDP, has long been the headline measure of economic performance, yet it increasingly fails to reflect the economic reality of modern households. GDP was conceived in an era when many families relied on a single breadwinner and most economic activity ran through formal employment. Today, the landscape has shifted. A majority of households depend on multiple earners, millions of individuals juggle side jobs or freelance gig work, and a significant amount of essential labor, like caregiving and housework, remains unpaid and excluded from GDP. This report examines why national GDP is a flawed metric for capturing household well-being in the 21st century and proposes a complementary framework called household GDP, which aggregates total household earnings across all jobs and income sources. By measuring gross household income and productivity in the era of side hustles and self-employment, household GDP would provide richer insights for policymakers, highlighting disparities, labor market shifts, and financial stress that GDP alone obscures. We outline the concepts rationale, data sources, methodological design, and policy applications, as well as addressing potential limitations, like privacy and standardization. Household GDP is not intended to replace GDP, but to complement it, enabling a more inclusive and nuanced understanding of economic progress that focuses on households' actual financial outcomes alongside aggregate national output. The problem: why traditional GDP misrepresents household economic reality. GDP's historical context and assumptions. GDP was developed in the mid-20th century to measure total economic output, with an implicit focus on market transactions. During that era, the typical household structure featured one primary earner, often the husband, and a homemaker spouse, meaning income distribution within households was simple, and rising GDP largely translated into rising income for the average family. Economist Simon Kuznets, an architect of national income accounting, notably warned in 1934 that GDP omits key aspects of welfare, such as the services of housewives and other family members in the home. Nevertheless, the GDP metric gained prominence as a broad gauge of growth, on the assumption that it correlated strongly with societal prosperity. Those foundational assumptions no longer hold true. Today's economies have evolved beyond the single earner model, and GDP's omissions and blind spots have widened. To illustrate the disconnect, in 1967, only 44% of U.S. married couple families were dual income, and 36% relied on the husband's income alone. By 2020, nearly 60% of these families had both spouses earning, while purely single-earner married families plunged to 19%. This dramatic shift means that measuring just aggregate output per capita, as GDP does, often fails to capture how households actually fare. GDP can grow even as family finances stagnate or worsen, because it doesn't account for how many paychecks each household needs to achieve a given standard of living, nor how income is distributed among individuals. Structural flaws of GDP in the modern economy. Several interrelated trends expose GDP's limitations as a measure of household economic well-being. Multiple earners and dual incomes. With living costs rising faster than single wages, two-income households have become the norm. More than half of U.S. households, 53.3%, had dual incomes by 2019, up from 52% a decade earlier. Middle-class families increasingly require two, or more, paychecks to afford housing, education, and childcare. A generation ago, one stable job might support a family. Now, relying on a single earner is often financially untenable in many regions. GDP growth does not reveal this fundamental change. It counts total output, but ignores how many workers per household it takes to generate that income. A country's GDP can rise even if families are working twice as many total hours to stay afloat. Household GDP as a concept responds to this by focusing on aggregate earnings at the household unit, providing insight into how broadly prosperity is shared and whether multiple incomes are effectively masking stagnation in individual wages. Rise of gig work and self-employment. The gig economy and freelance work have exploded, yet they are imperfectly captured by standard economic indicators. Many people now earn income outside of traditional payroll jobs, from rideshare driving to online freelancing, often in addition to formal employment. As of 2025, an estimated 70+ million Americans, over 36% of the workforce, engage in freelance or gig work, contributing roughly $1.3 trillion to the U.S. economy. Additionally, 5.2% of U.S. workers hold multiple jobs simultaneously, a near-record 8.9 million people, as of early 2026. These trends mean household incomes are increasingly sourced from multiple streams: wages, side gigs, contracting, small businesses, rather than a single paycheck. While GDP does include the output of these segments, to the extent they are formally Formally recorded, it does not identify the growing reliance on layered income streams as a sign of economic strain or adaptation. GDP fails to differentiate between one person earning $100,000 at one job versus two people each earning $50,000 or one person working two $50,000 jobs, but these scenarios have very different implications for time use, job security, and family life. A household GDP approach would explicitly measure and track total earnings per household, illuminating phenomena like the side hustle surge, and how reliant households are on secondary income sources for basic financial stability. Informal and unpaid labor excluded, traditional GDP ignores enormous swaths of productive activity that fall outside monetized markets. This includes informal sector income, e.g. cash jobs, barter, subsistence work, and, importantly, unpaid but essential labor within households. The latter encompasses childcare, elder care, housework, and other domestic tasks often performed without pay, historically by women. Such labor is economically vital. Its omission from GDP understates the true scope of productive work. The U.S. Bureau of Economic Analysis, BEA, estimated that counting unpaid household work would have inflated 2010 GDP by about 26%, roughly $3.8 trillion. In 1965, when more domestic labor was unpaid, including it would have boosted measured output by nearly 39%. GDP's failure to value these contributions skews our picture of economic well-being, particularly as dual-earner arrangements force families to outsource childcare or incur other costs that were previously handled within the home. While household GDP in the narrow sense focuses on household earnings, actual income, an extended household GDP plus could incorporate a satellite account for the value of unpaid work, making the metric even more comprehensive, engaging household-level production and well-being beyond market receipts. Inequality and distributional blind spots. Perhaps the most critical flaw is that GDP is a mean aggregate. It tells nothing about how income is shared across society or within households. Over recent decades, economic growth has often failed to reach the median household. As Nobel laureate Joseph Stiglitz and others have observed, median household income has stagnated, even declined in some periods, while GDP per capita steadily rose, owing to increasing inequality. For instance, in the US the typical family's real income growth lagged far behind per capita GDP growth from the late 20th century onward. GDP growth can be driven disproportionately by incomes of top earners or corporate profits, creating a prosperity gap between what the economy produces and what an average household actually gains. Traditional GDP per capita, an average, can thus mask economic stress on households. A growing economy on paper might still leave many families feeling left behind if their own incomes are flat. By design, household GDP emphasizes the total income earned by households, and can be assessed per household or per adult, making it easier to track distributional outcomes. For example, one could compare the growth rate of household GDP per household versus GDP per capita. Any persistent divergence would flag that household living standards are not keeping up with macro growth. In short, a household-centric metric inherently leans toward measuring broad-based prosperity rather than average output alone. The proposal, household GDP, a complementary metric focused on household earnings. Concept overview: household GDP, sometimes referred to as gross household product, is a proposed national accounting measure that aggregates the total gross income produced by households. It is designed to complement traditional GDP by shifting the perspective from the output of an economy, the sum of all goods and services produced, to the incomes of its people at the household level. In essence, household GDP asks, how much economic value are households collectively generating and receiving through their labor and entrepreneurial activities? Scope and definition: household GDP would encompass all income generated by individuals and their household-based enterprises, including wages and salaries from employment, income from self-employment, freelancing, and side jobs, small business profits of unincorporated enterprises, and other labor-related earnings. It focuses on the household as the unit of analysis, summing the earnings of all members within each household, then aggregating across the country. Unlike GDP, which counts corporate retained earnings and various non-household components, household GDP centers on the portion of economic output that directly accrues to households, essentially the labor share plus proprietors' income and other personal income flows. By capturing total gross household earnings, it reflects not only primary jobs but also secondary jobs and diverse income streams that many families rely on. Notably, household GDP could be measured as an aggregate, nationwide total, and normalized as per household or per capita averages, but critically it can also be disaggregated by household type, region, or income percentile to provide distributional insight, something a single GDP number cannot do. Relationship to existing metrics. This concept aligns with and extends some existing indicators, but is distinct in focus. Traditional GDP tallies output by production location and includes components, like corporate profits retained by firms, government value added, etc., that are not immediately experienced as household income. Gross national income, GNI, and gross domestic income, GDI, are closer to what households and other domestic entities earn, but they still aggregate all income including corporate and government sectors. Median household income is a well-known statistic highlighting the midpoint of household earnings distribution. Household GDP differs by summing all household incomes, not just medians, and by providing an integrated macro framework to compare against GDP. In effect, household GDP would be like taking the national accounts into the micro-domain, answering, if households were considered the production units, what is their total output and how is it evolving? Unlike purely welfare-oriented indices that include health or education metrics, household GDP remains an economic measure, but one that places household-level productivity and earnings at the forefront. It serves as a complementary lens to GDP, not replacing it but adding an official measure that better tracks broad-based economic prosperity and labor market changes impacting families. Household GDP in practice, what it measures. To clarify the concept, the following table contrasts conventional GDP with the proposed household GDP on key dimensions. Conventional GDP. Aspect. National output. Household GDP, household earnings. Definition. Total value of all final goods and services produced within a country's borders, market production, in a period. Total gross income earned by individuals and households from all work and household-run business activity in the same period. Includes consumer spending, business investment, government spending, net exports, measured by value of output. Also includes corporate profits, even if not paid out, as part of value added. Wages, salaries, and benefits from employment, proprietors/self-employment income, independent contractor earnings, farm income, gig/platform earnings, small business net income accruing to households. Optionally, could incorporate distributed investment income. Interest, dividends, if focusing on all household receipts. Excludes/omissions. Unpaid work, informal/illegal economy, does not detail who receives income. GDP by itself does not distinguish how output is split among workers versus capital owners or among households. Corporate retained earnings, profits not passed to people, are excluded to focus on household-generated output. Government transfers could be excluded, to measure only earned income, or reported separately. Valuation of unpaid household labor is excluded in core measure, to restrict to actual earnings, but can be tracked in a satellite account for broader welfare analysis. Unit of analysis. Economy-wide aggregate, typically reported per capita but no direct household-level interpretation. Can be aggregated to national total, but naturally expresses as per household, or per person, and can be disaggregated by demographic or region. Emphasizes household-level economic capacity and participation. Key insight provided. Overall economic size and growth rate, economic pie size, used for productivity and growth analysis at macro scale. Economic well-being and productive contribution of households, shows how much households are earning, and therefore able to spend or save, and reveals multi-earner dynamics. Inequality, and livelihood sustainability. Methodology and data sources. Accurately constructing household GDP would require integrating data from several sources to capture all forms of income. Practically, it could be implemented via enhanced national accounts or a new annual statistical release by agencies like the BEA, in the US, or national statistical offices elsewhere. Income components in accounting. Household GDP, HGDP, would sum up all forms of labor and enterprise income earned by households. In formula terms, for a given time period, example a year. HGDP equals sigma, wages and salaries, plus sigma, proprietor's income, plus sigma, farm income, plus sigma, independent contractor earnings, plus sigma, side hustle/gig income, plus, etc., summed across all households. Each household's contribution is the total of its members' earnings from all jobs and self-employment. This is conceptually related to the personal income statistics in national accounts, but household GDP would focus on gross earnings from work and production, excluding, for instance, pure transfer payments or capital gains, which are not direct production output. Adjustments would be needed to avoid double counting and align with national totals. For example, a small business owner's net income might be captured as proprietor's income, while wages of their employees are counted under wages. Data collection. To populate this metric, statisticians would rely on administrative data and surveys. Key inputs include tax records, payroll data, business income filings, labor force surveys, household surveys revealing multiple job holding, etc., and special surveys of gig/platform earnings. For example, tax forms like W-2S in the U.S. report wages per job. Schedule C or 1099 forms cover non-employee compensation and small business profits. Combining these at a household level, using taxpayer household identifiers while protecting privacy, would yield a comprehensive income tally. National labor force or household income surveys, such as the Current Population Survey or American Community Survey in the U.S., provide cross-checks and help capture data on informal earnings or incomes below tax filing thresholds. Statistical methods could integrate these data sources to construct a complete picture of each household's income portfolio. Advances in data analytics and administrative data linking make such integration more feasible than in the past, albeit with heavy emphasis on confidentiality. Frequency and reporting. Initially, household GDP might be calculated annually, aligned with annual income data. Over time, as data collection improves, a quarterly or semi-annual household GDP could be estimated to align with the GDP release cycle, providing a timelier barometer of household earnings growth. The output could include headline figures such as total household GDP per household, per capita, and growth rates thereof. Distributional breakdowns could accompany the aggregate release, for example, growth in household GDP for the bottom 50% of households versus the top 10%, or differences by region, to directly inform inclusive growth discussions. Incorporating volatility and diversification. Beyond static totals, the household GDP framework could measure income volatility and diversification, two increasingly relevant aspects in the gig age. For instance, statistical agencies could publish supplementary indicators derived from microdata: how many households have high variability in monthly income, what share of households have income from 2, 3, or more sources, etc. These would enrich the basic HGDP metric, showing not just how much is earned but how steady or precarious those earnings are. Such insights are crucial for understanding financial security and designing safety nets. Why household GDP matters. A new signal. By distilling all household earnings into one cohesive measure, household GDP would function as a barometer of the populace's productive welfare. Policymakers and analysts could compare household GDP growth versus traditional GDP growth to see whether economic gains are broad-based or lopsided. For example, if GDP is growing faster than household GDP, it might indicate that more income is accruing to non-household actors, like corporate retained profits or the wealthy few, signaling rising inequality or a falling labor share. If the gap between GDP and household GDP widens, it flags that macro growth isn't translating fully into household earnings, prompting a re-examination of policies around wages, labor bargaining power, or profit sharing. In summary, household GDP offers a clearer mirror for households' economic experience, focusing on the quantity and composition of incomes families bring home, which is a critical complement to knowing the total output of the economy. Policy applications. Using household GDP to inform better economic policy. Adopting household GDP as an official statistic would equip policymakers with a powerful tool to monitor living standards and design responsive policies. Key use cases include tracking inclusive growth and inequality. Household GDP can help answer whether economic growth is improving typical households' situations. For instance, If traditional GDP expands briskly but household GDP per household stagnates or only rises for the top earners, policymakers would have early warning of inequality-driven gaps. Use case: a government aiming for inclusive growth could set targets for household GDP per median household growth, not just overall GDP, ensuring that prosperity is widespread. By examining growth contributions to household GDP from different segments, example which deciles are gaining, programs can be tailored to uplift lagging groups, through tax policy, wage support, and training initiatives. Labor market resilience and quality of work. Because household GDP explicitly captures multi-job situations and side gigs, it provides insight into labor market health beyond the unemployment rate. If high GDP growth coincides with many households piecing together multiple jobs to sustain income, it suggests underlying weakness in job quality or wages that might be obscured by a low jobless rate. Use case: labor departments could use household GDP data to gauge if rising costs of living are pushing more people into second jobs. If so, it might prompt policies such as minimum wage adjustments, stronger collective bargaining support, or child care subsidies, to ease the need for dual incomes. Similarly, if a large share of household GDP growth comes from gig work, regulators might focus on ensuring those gigs provide fair income and benefits. Benchmarking living standards, household GDP per household, or per capita, could become a new headline indicator of national well-being, akin to how GDP per capita is often used but more reflective of everyday reality. Internationally, countries could compare household GDP per household as a measure of typical living standards. Use case: a country might find that while its GDP per capita is high, its household GDP per household is relatively lower than peers, perhaps due to high corporate profits but low wages, or lower labor force participation. This would signal to policymakers that improvements in labor share of income or broader workforce inclusion are needed to catch up in terms of household prosperity. Macroeconomic policy and forecasting. Central banks and finance ministries can incorporate household GDP into their analysis of economic cycles. Because household earnings largely drive consumer spending, household GDP growth might be a better predictor of consumption trends than aggregate GDP, especially in times of shifting labor patterns. Use case: in an economic shock, say a pandemic or recession, tracking household GDP could quickly show the hit to aggregate household income. If it falls faster than overall GDP, for example, if corporate profits hold up while wages plunge, that informs how aggressive income support or stimulus needs to be to shore up demand. It also helps evaluate the efficacy of fiscal measures. After a stimulus, a rebound in household GDP would confirm that money reached households, not just financial markets. Social policy and taxation. A comprehensive view of household income streams facilitates better targeted tax and transfer policies. With richer data on how households earn and how volatile their incomes are, governments can design tax codes that accommodate multiple job holders, example streamlining tax withholding for gig earnings, and bolster social insurance for those with erratic incomes. Use case: if household GDP data reveal a large cohort of households relying on precarious gig income, a government might consider creating or expanding benefits like portable benefits accounts, or adjust unemployment insurance to cover gig workers. For taxation, understanding total household earnings, including side income, might influence tax brackets or credits to ensure fairness, preventing those with multiple part-time gigs from being taxed unfavorably relative to one-job counterparts. In sum, household GDP could guide a shift in economic management, emphasizing quality of growth, how well it supports households, rather than quantity alone. Governments, central bankers, and social planners would gain a clearer line of sight to household financial health, enabling more nuanced and responsive interventions from wage policies to safety nets. Implementation challenges and safeguards. Introducing household GDP as a formal metric does come with challenges and considerations that must be managed. Data integration and accuracy. Gathering the myriad data on household incomes, from formal wages to informal gigs, and integrating them reliably is non-trivial. It requires robust systems to link records by household while respecting privacy. Statistical agencies might start with partial data and then improve coverage, for example, initially focusing on tax-reported income and gradually incorporating more informal estimates. Ensuring that household GDP aligns with known totals, like aggregate compensation of employees from national accounts, would be important for consistency and credibility. Methodologies need transparency, and possibly legislation to mandate reporting of certain income types, example requiring gig platforms to provide standardized earnings reports, to fill data gaps. Privacy and confidentiality. Since this metric touches on sensitive individual and household income data, strong privacy safeguards are essential. All data processing should occur under strict confidentiality, with outputs only published in aggregate or anonymized forms. Lessons can be drawn from how agencies handle census and tax data. Gaining public trust in a new indicator will depend on demonstrating that personal information isn't compromised and that the aim is statistical insight, not surveillance. Definition and international comparability. What counts as household earnings could vary by country or over time. For comparability, clear international standards would need to be developed, potentially under the guidance of organizations like the UN Statistics Division as part of the System of National Accounts, SNA, updates. For example, should household GDP include government cash transfers, like Social Security or unemployment benefits? Since those are not earned via current productive activity, the core metric might exclude them, but they could be reported in parallel, to show household disposable income versus earned income. These definitional choices must be consistent and transparent to make household GDP a useful tool globally. Risk of misinterpretation. As with any new statistic, there is a learning curve. Policymakers and media will need guidance to interpret household GDP correctly. For instance, a rising household GDP can signal improvements in total earnings, but if it's driven mainly by households working more hours or multiple jobs, that nuance is important. Similarly, one must be careful not to double count this with GDP. Household GDP is a complementary perspective. It should be communicated that a strong economy should ideally see both GDP and household GDP growing in tandem. Divergences carry meaning, like inequality, rather than one being right and the other wrong. Over-reliance on any single number is a risk. Even household GDP would need context from other statistics, example productivity, inflation, etc. The solution is to incorporate it into a dashboard of indicators and train users in its interpretation. Adaptability. The nature of work is still evolving. Think about the rise of automation, remote work, or new forms of digital earning. Any new metric should be designed with flexibility to adapt to future shifts. Household GDP's broad definition of earnings positions it well to accommodate change, since whether incomes come from a factory job or a virtual microtask platform, they are still income. Nonetheless, the implementation team should regularly review and refine methods to capture emerging income streams, example revenue from content creation on social media, cryptocurrency earnings, etc., as these become significant. In addressing these challenges, policymakers can look to precedents like the development of satellite accounts, example for environmental or household production, by statistical agencies, which show it's feasible to augment core national accounts with new measures. The key is a careful development process with expert input, pilot testing, and clear communication. Conclusion. As economies and household structures transform, our metrics for economic success must evolve as well. National GDP remains invaluable for tracking overall output, but it is no longer sufficient for understanding how typical households are faring in an age of dual incomes, gig work, and rising inequality. Household GDP offers a modernized lens. By measuring total household earnings and the distribution of those earnings, it aligns economic indicators more closely with lived experience. This policy proposal has argued that national GDP is a flawed standalone metric, not because it is measured incorrectly, but because it paints an incomplete picture of economic progress. Household GDP, used alongside GDP, can correct that blind spot by highlighting whether growth is truly benefiting the many or just the few. Implementing household GDP would require effort and innovation in data collection, but it would yield a rich, policy-relevant dataset to guide decisions. It could illuminate, for example, how much multi-jobbing is contributing to income growth, or whether households are gaining ground or losing ground despite positive GDP headlines. It underscores that the ultimate purpose of economic growth is to improve people's material well-being. By focusing on household incomes and contributions, the metric implicitly reframes economic success in terms of broad prosperity and resilience, not just raw production. In practical terms, household GDP could become a standard economic indicator reported by statistical agencies, much like GDP or employment rates. Citizens and legislators would gain a clearer benchmark: is the pie of household income expanding, and for whom? In the long run, embracing such complementary metrics will help ensure that economic policy stays grounded in reality, addressing the needs of families and individuals, rather than steering by averages that obscure disparities. In an economy defined by diverse work arrangements and shared challenges, household GDP is a timely innovation to measure what truly matters: the economic health of households that collectively form the backbone of any nation's prosperity.